Assalamu alaikum. I'm Fasih, and I'm a justified believer.
And I'm Laura, and I'm an unapologist.
So, we were going to continue our conversation from last time about the Gospel of John. Specifically, we were talking about says who. So, last time we discussed who is the one who said that this is the Gospel of John as it pertains to Irenaeus. Today, we're going to look at a little bit more into the text of the Gospel itself.
So I think we're going to start at the beginning, no place like
The
the beginning.
beginning, yeah,
Yeah,
in the beginning, right?
So the first chapter of John is rich with Greek philosophy. And Fasih has also found that it's plagiarized. So he is going to share with us where it came from, and then we'll go through the merging of the Greek philosophy with the Jewish thought.
So, whenever somebody comes across any Christian and, they start talking about the claims of Jesus being God, and you often ask them, okay, where does it say that? Sometimes what they do is they connect the first verse of the first chapter of the book of John to everything else. This is the foundational thing. What does it say? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, this, if you read it in Greek, the word is logos. But there's other theologies around the world that actually have had these thoughts before. So specifically, let me pull up this reference here. So if I said Prajapati vai idam agra asit, tasya vag davitya asit, vag vai praman brahman, most of the people would not know what it means. Why? Because what
Including
I just,
me.
including you, because what I just read is from Sanskrit. And what it translates to is, in the beginning was Prajapati, with whom was the Word, and the Word was verily Brahman. Now the reference for this is Krishna Yajurveda Kataka Samhita 12.5, 27.1, Krishna Yajurveda Kataka Pistala Samhita 42.1, Jaiminiya Brahmana 2, Samaveda 22.44. Now,
Now,
it's
Fasih, does this predate the writing of the Book of John? And if it does, by how much?
by at least a millennium. Some say about 1500 years. What is interesting is that I was actually reading a book. I've got this here. It's called Knowledge: A Very Short Introduction. It's one of the books that Oxford University Press produces. Right, it's a series of books about short introduction to different topics. This book is specifically written by Jennifer Nagel, and in this book, she speaks about Pyrrho traveling with the Greek forces who were on a conquest towards the east, mingling with the Indian philosophers. This is around 2nd century BCE. And we cannot ignore the fact that this is perhaps something that they brought along with. But before we even consider that idea, we also have to look at what logos is. And you have something to say about that, right?
Right. So I find the evolution of this logos philosophy before it became intermingled with the Jewish theology. I find it very interesting because it kind of traveled down through the philosophers, and they all just kind of tweaked it. It started out with this Heraclitus, right, in like 535 BCE, and he taught that this was the essence of reality. This was the fabric of the universe. And it was not divine. It was not personified. There was no no morality. It was just the balance in nature. Whenever it got to the Stoics, it got kind of interesting. And Logos was the divine fire. Now, I find this one interesting because the Stoics believed that they were materialists, right? So they believed that everything was made of some type of matter, right? There was no, like, how people today will talk about things being spirit or the unseen or whatnot. They didn't believe that. They believed that this permeated everything, this matter. and that each person had some piece of this divine fire. That's what gave them life, or the quote unquote quickening. So once it got to the Middle Platonists, that's when things got kind of, I don't want to say like weird, but it got kind of weird.
Hmm.
So they started saying that that the God was too pure to interact with his creation. That his creation was so beneath him that to interact with his creation would you know, lessen his deity. So there had to be an intermediary. So they came up with this logos as the divine intermediary, which it basically, was the go between God and whatever his creation was, whatever matter was. And then it came to Philo. And Philo was a Jewish theologian who, I'm kind of harsh with him a little bit because I think he kind of messed things up, but he didn't really meet the standard for being a philosopher proper, because he either couldn't or wouldn't discipline himself, and the philosophers, that's why they called it the disciplines, right? They tried to perfect themselves as much as they could. Philo, nah, he said there, which is, echoes of Paul. He says that there's only one form of good, and that's the highest form of good, and so why bother, right?
So you talked about Heraclitus. So we have to read so there's this collection of fragments from, I mean, these fragments are attributed to the writings of Heraclitus. So this is fragment DK 22b1. And it reads, although this logos is true always, men are as unable to understand it when they hear it for the first time as before they have heard it at all. All things come to pass in accordance with this logos. Then in fragment DK 22b2, he says, for this logos, which is forever, men prove uncomprehending. So he's already leaning into this understanding of logos, which is unattainable,
Hmm.
and an understanding or comprehension that is unattainable. Then it comes down to the fragment DK22b50. Listening not to me, but to this logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. So these are some references from his writing. I think there's these authors that actually wrote a book about this, and let me see if I have the reference for that one, because I did note it down. So there is a book by Kirk Raven Schofield. It's called The Pre-Socratic Philosophers. It's a second edition from 1983.
Is it? It's not the Schofield Bible guy, is it?
No, it's not the Schofield Bible guy, but they talk about Heraclitus. So they have a chapter on Heraclitus, and specifically fragments from B1 and B50. So they talk about his teachings. So you were talking about Philo and how he messed things up. There's already this idea of something being uncomprehending in the idea of logos being pushed by Heraclitus himself.
Mhm. Do you find that they were very defeatist? It's like a lot of like the things that they were just like so ready to be like, oh, it's beyond me, throw in the towel. Like,
But I suppose that would be a overriding thought for all stages of human development, right? Because think about people who didn't have telescopes. They were just relying on their own observations from the eye. But what happens when somebody who has certain knowledge starts losing his eyesight, or he develops some sort of problems with his eyesight that he cannot see clearly? But now we do have telescopes. We have corrective lenses that we can wear. So it's sort of like you can get a bit more extension into your study and into your scholarship. So defeatist, yes, but is it? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's the surroundings that make them defeatist, or is it just them by themselves being defeated because they're like, no, we cannot comprehend this.
yeah, I mean, I can see it. In the case of like Philo and Paul, I find that they were very much like, oh, you know, God's the only thing that's good, and just like there's no, I can't attain this thing, so I don't try.
Yeah.
I just I just, I find that to be, that's what I mean by defeatist, right? But Philo, fusing this Hebrew theology and the Greek metaphysics, bringing forward this transcendent God who can't touch matter, can't, because it lessens his deity that he brought forth from the Middle Platonists. So one thing that I will say, Philo still there was still with Philo a level of subordination, right? That this logos, this intermediary, was still not equal with God, was still subordinate to God. He called it a second God, but still subordinate. It was like the manifestation of divine reasoning. Well, one of the things that I was looking at is trying to extract maybe what the actual Jewish theology was before, it got kind of tangled up. And in Hebraic thought, it was that this word, it's davar in Hebrew, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Forgive me if I am. But it means God's creative command, his wisdom, right? It's a possession of, right? I don't understand personification of attributes, right? It's like God is love, God is, this, he's that.
This is a huge thing in Christianity.
Huge thing. And that's all you hear really is that God is love, right? But they forget in the Old Testament, he's also jealousy, wrath, and all those things too.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I find it just interesting that this taking this thing that God does, right, and personifying it and making it another God started here. And Paul had his way with it, but ultimately I think it was like the church fathers who got us where we are today. Very interesting.
So one thing to note about Philo is that Philo is sometimes the poster boy of Hellenization of Jewish theology. And I was looking into it, like the translation from the Hebrew scripture to Septuagint, right? And I actually came across something, which was that there's a letter that was written, letter of Aristeas. And it's supposed to be this letter that describes that there were these 72 Jewish elders, 6 from each of the 12 tribes that were brought to Alexandria, by Ptolemy II, Philadelphia. And they were the ones who were translating the Torah into Greek. But there are several scholars like Emmanuel Tov, Natalio Fernandez Marcos, Albert Pietersma, Benjamin G. Wright, Henry B. Sweet. All of these people, they say that this is a legendary story. What they say is possibly, and most likely, the thing is that it took several centuries to complete this translation. What Emmanuel Tov says in his book, In Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, he says that it's likely that the Pentateuch was the only thing, Pentateuch being the first 5 books of the Torah or the Tanakh, was the only thing that was actually translated in the early 3rd centuries. So we understand that there's already an interaction between the Greco-Roman Empire and the Jewish populace in the Levant region, right? So I find that fascinating that there's these interactions and these thoughts being exchanged. But then when it comes to Philo, things get a little bit wonky. Or perhaps Philo is being made the scapegoat, perhaps. It's also a possibility.
I don't think that the Jewish scholarship considered themselves to be philosophers. I
Hmm.
think that they tried to understand what the thought at the time was, and maybe educate themselves on how to be able to communicate, with the people in their communities. So I don't think that they were necessarily trying to become philosophers. I think that they were trying to find out how to communicate with the times, like move with the times, so to speak. What happened with Philo was that Philo wanted to be a philosopher. I read a good bit about it. I think it was the Stanford University articles that they had, where they talked about his desire to be a philosopher, but kind of I guess, falling short, right? And just that he didn't really meet the qualifications because he didn't make that effort. Like he wasn't trying to subdue himself and let go of these worldly pleasures and whatnot. He was trying to basically create a theology around his nature.
So what is I find this development like interesting because Heraclitus introduces the idea of what this logos is, or at least he's teaching this as something cosmic divine rationality. But not this is not supposed to be theological as being taught by Heraclitus. But then when it comes to the Stoics, that's when it becomes more theological and more religious in its formation. But then Philo takes it and to another step where he's explicitly turning this logos into a theological concept, as in what, like you said, a divine intermediary between God and creation.
Yeah, but with Philo, he took this Jewish theology and he intermingled it in such a way that he was explaining the Jewish like teachings with the Greek philosophy. And so whenever as this goes out, or people are learning from him, they're this is it's intertwined now. And you can see it
Mm,
we've talked before, you can see it in Paul's writings, right? I think I remember us having a conversation once about, we were reading about Plato's forms, and I had to kind of laugh because whenever there's a place where Paul talks about, for now we behold through a glass darkly, but then face to face, it's literally Plato's cave analogy, right? So they did things in such a way that they were trying to, and I don't know if it was like trying to keep up with the times, and maybe it started with a good intention, but what it did was pervert the teaching and the meaning, right?
yeah.
And you have the book of John, and it's more Greek philosophy than it is like theology.
Speaking of that philosophy part, right? We started with John 1:1 and we started talking about logos. What I find weird is that there's this thing that John, whoever this person is writing this book is, starts off with the strongest philosophical concept there is at the time. And then when it comes down to John 1:14, the word became flesh, because this is what they want to tie that to, because the claim is Jesus was the word, he became flesh. That you find in some Christians, you find impossible to break that apart, this concept. They don't have a differentiating factor in
No.
this.
So that's why they believe that Jesus is God, right? Because
Mm,
because obviously the first sentence, the word was with God, the word was God, right? And then the word was made flesh, right? But the thing is, the Gnostics, right? Okay, so these gospels, right? The synoptics were favored by different groups, right? And the Gnostics favored the book of John, right? Because it was very rich in like the metaphysics and the mystical um uh type information, So um the Gnostics were the ones who favored the book of John. I think this was sort of a way that Irenaeus was able to, this is why there had to be four, right? Because it was bringing all four of these groups together. It was bringing the Ebionites and the Nazarenes who preferred Matthew. It was bringing the Marcionites and whoever else. I can't remember the other group that favored Luke. And there was a group that favored Mark. It was the Petrine Roman groups who favored Mark. So the Pauline groups used Luke. The Petrine, which is Peter, Roman groups used Mark, and the Johannine mystics used John. The Ebionites and the Nazarenes used a Hebrew version of Matthew. And Irenaeus says that because there's four corners of the earth, there's four winds and four living creatures in the book of Ezekiel, which I thought was random and weird. Like, what does that have to do with anything? That there needed to be four gospels. But I think it was to actually bring all these groups under their kind of control.
So I think I mentioned earlier that, because you mentioned Irenaeus again, Irenaeus Irenaeus himself proposing that he was a student of
Mhm.
student of
Yeah,
Polycarp.
Polycarp.
Polycarp did travel to Ephesus, according to some literature, and all of this theology from uh, Ptolemy. I think this is also connected to Ephesus, by the way. Let me just double check, because I did write something down. This is the side quest now. It's supposed to be from the Septuagint. I think wrote it down. Oh no, so they were in Alexandria. No, they were in
Okay.
Alexandria.
So if I'm not
And
mistaken,
Philo is also in Alexandria.
yeah, he's from Alexandria. Um, so if I'm not mistaken, I know that John is supposed to have been buried in Ephesus. So I'm relatively certain that that's where Polycarp was at one point. I think that one of the things that I find really interesting also is the huge disparity in age, right? Polycarp was, he died well into his 80s, and I think Irenaeus would have been in his early 20s at this time, maybe late teens. And so making the claim that this was his teacher um, is a little far fetched for me.
So I found
So,
out
but
it was
anyway,
Heraclitus. So I found out it was Heraclitus of Ephesus.
okay.
There you go. That was the connection.
So, and there was no pre-Irenaeus attribution. No author was named, and there was no mention by Papias. And I didn't really understand the significance, but apparently Papias was a historian who was like documenting like all of these things, and there was no mention from him that there was a known gospel written by John. One of the things that, I mean, they anytime we have conversations with like apologists or whatnot, Christian apologists, they always say, well, this was written, I think it's like around 80 AD, 80 to 120, but it wasn't introduced until 180. So, and it was introduced by Irenaeus. No eyes had laid on it but those of Irenaeus. And I'm starting to see a picture, not to vilify the man, but it's not looking, my estimation of him is not very high. Like, he's the sole, person with knowledge of this book. He
Mm.
conveniently brings this book to the table to tie in this metaphysical, rhetoric. Um, I, you know, coincidence?
Well, this is why I think we're gonna have to end this here now, right? But this is one of the things where I often ask, well, why is John starting his book with this? Where is he getting this from? Because that's a excellent question to ask, because he's not quoting Jesus. So who is he quoting? But if we look into it a little deeper, this is what we find, that he's quoting this mishmash of theology, philosophy, and it's one of the things which makes it bizarre, that it's actually not coming from Jesus himself.
So ultimately, I look at Philo, who took this Stoic logos to explain how this invisible God interacted with the material world, and he even called this logos the firstborn of God, which, as you might imagine, created quite a theological mess that we're still trying to clean up to this day. And then,
Hmm.
of course, the Book of John took that language and fused it with this Jewish theology even more. And now this logos that began as just simply the thing that was holding the universe together is now a human being named Jesus.
Mm. Well, with that, we're going to say bye to this episode. And next time, we're going to explore a little bit more about this. and we'll see where we go on our side quest. Assalamu alaikum.